Hello and welcome back. One of the key points of developing good code is to document the code properly. And one of the standard ways to do this in Python is using the package called Sphinx. So here we will walk through the installation of usage of this package. First of all, why should we bother? Consider, for example, the following. Someone else will use your code, so they will have to understand what the code does. Of course, they could ask you, but maybe you've already moved on to different projects. Or, even worse, you have to take over code from someone else, and if it's not properly documented, you have to understand what it's doing. And even worse, you can be your own worst enemy. Maybe you want to revisit a project you've stopped working on for a little bit, and so you have to remember what you actually meant by programming what you did. So it's really a good practice to make it easy to understand for us and also for others what the code does, what, for example, the input arguments are, what the return values are, what the function does, and what the purpose of the code is. As a best practice, it turns out that it's near impossible to add too much documentation to the code. So if you probably added a lot of documentation, you can easily say, okay, let's double that. One of the standard ways of creating nice documentation in Python is using the Sphinx package. It's the Python documentation generator, and it's a popular toolkit to build web-based or also PDF and EPUB applications on it. The key objective is to create RST files that hold the project documentation, and RST is a special text-based format. It stands for restructured text. It's like an alternative to Markdown or other formats that are purely text-based. So an example is README RST, and many repos use this as well. So we have a headline and a link, and the headline is really just indicated by using the double underscores. And you can also see there is a web link to it, and you use the special syntax to highlight that this is a web link in RST format. So the key thing is to generate these files. Before we can then use the files, we need to install Sphinx, and we walk now through the installation. I'll use Poetry here, and to install things in our setup, we use Poetry and Sphinx. That will download the required packages and also resolve any dependencies, and we can test the installation by calling Sphinx build version. That should give us the most recent version or the one we installed. Next, we need to initialize Sphinx. So there is a quick start, and that asks us a few questions. For example, if we want to have a separate build, yes, we take the default there, we put our name and the authors and everything in it, and the name is the package that we want to document, the version, the language, and so on. So we can typically add the appropriate points where the code initialization asks us to, and accept usable defaults. And then after we've done this, we should have now a directory structure like this. Our package, as an example, is called documentation, and this is where our source code will live. And Sphinx created automatically everything below the docs directory. So we see that we have build and source and some other directories. Now we need to build the initial documentation structure, and we do this with the command sphinx build-b html, source or destination. So these are the directories, and you can see here from the screenshot what they should be in our example, and this will build the general scaffolding. Alternatively, we can go to the directory doc source and type make html. That will create the scaffolding for the HTML documentation. So now we have basically everything. We can go to code documentation or packages to the docs directory to build. So this is what Sphinx has done after we run this command to HTML. Of course, you could also have EPUB and other formats. Right, and then click on index.html. That will open a web page. And here we are with our very first version of our code documentation. Now, of course, we need to configure this and extend this a bit and actually document our code. So useful additions are Autodoc, Napoleon, and Vue code, and we do this by editing the file docs source conf.py. Autodoc is very useful for auto-generating docs from the source code. Napoleon makes it a bit more readable, and Vue code allows us to have links in the code highlights. So we add the extensions. By default it's a blank list, and we add those 3 in there. and then we also need to tell Sphinx where to look for our code. This one here we add the syspath insert and then the apps path, and then dot dot slash dot dot means 2 directories up and look everything below from there, and then it will find our code. And now we actually need to start documenting our code. So we have, for example, the starting point. This isn't too bad. We have descriptive function names and we have descriptive variable names, and we also have some comments, but this is quite far from proper code documentation. So method 1 is to write all the RST files. Remember what we said in the beginning, the key to the documentation is to write these RST files, this restructure test. So the method 1 would be to write all of those manually and thus document our code. This is of course not what we want to do. So we want to use method 2, where we let Sphinx create all those files for us. And this is where this autodoc extension comes in. What we need to do is to add so-called doc strings to our code. And the general pattern is the following. They are enclosed in triple quotes. They start with a summary text. They give a description of the function arguments, for example, and then a description of the return values. As a general piece of advice, when you use an integrated development environment, for example, like Visual Studio Code or others, use a suitable plugin to help generate these templates so that you can just fill in the necessary bits and pieces. So this is what's done here. This has 2 benefits. The code itself is documented, and also these doc strings are then used by the Sphinx package to generate the documentation. So if you remember our previous version of this function, it didn't have the 3 triple quotes. So the doc string, and this is then really auto-generated in parts at least by the IDE plugin, starts with triple quotes, and then we give a general description of what the function does. And then it says args : so here we give it the number of arguments and describe each of them. We also describe maybe a type, what we would expect, and what this argument does, and we have returns. We have a list of integers in our case, but we may have something else in other functions. And now we add our modules to the code documentation and create the files that hold it. And the files modules RST hold the details about which code is to be documented. There we need to put the code documentation in there and configure it properly. And once we've done this, we add the modules RST to the index RST, right? The modules describe which part of the code we want to document. Then we can create the documentation. For example, we can use Sphinx build as we did before, or we can use make HTML. And now the documentation is created from those doc strings via the autodoc package. And then if we then open the web page, we can see that this is nicely generated for us. We can also have links between the source code and back. So when we look at the code documentation, we can also jump directly to a web page showing us the code, so we can compare the documentation with the actual implementation. The theme we've just seen is the standard theme. It's quite basic. There's a large gallery that you can choose from. For example, the Read the Docs is a very popular one, and we install this into our local environment. It's another Python package. And then we add it to the conf py. There's a part called HTML theme. And then if we rebuild the documentation, it looks in a different way, and you can really choose which kind of theme you favor most.